being with us. We're very, very excited to have you all here today. To have a community of educators come together, I think is very powerful because there's so much we can do as educators when we come together. So just to start with, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Maya Thiagarajan. I'm the founder and education director of TREE. And TREE, as most of you know, is an organization dedicated to teachers and to educators. We recruit, develop, support, and inspire educators. And we also are creating a community of educators because we genuinely believe that together, as educators, we can all do wonderful things. We can transform classrooms, transform education, and transform society. Today, I'm very, very, very excited to have a very special guest with us. We have Dr. Fernando Reimers here. Hi, Fernando. Dr. Fernando is a professor of international education at Harvard University. He also leads the Global Education Initiative at Harvard. He is a prolific writer. He's written or edited 37 books on education, which is very impressive. And actually his most recent book, I think, is very relevant to all of us. It's a book on reopening after the pandemic and kind of learning from the pandemic and figuring out where to go from here, which I think is, will be of great use to all of us. So I would love to share it with our community. On a more personal note, Fernando was my professor many years ago. So it's very, very special to have him here with us today. So Fernando, with no further ado, I'm going to get started asking you some questions. The last 2 years have represented a huge disruption, or the last 16 months, to be more specific, for schools around the world. And in India, because of the digital divide, many children from vulnerable backgrounds have not had access to education at all, to formal education, right? They haven't had the devices that enable that, or it's been very patchy. I would love to know what your thoughts are about the impact of the pandemic on children, especially on our most vulnerable children, right? Because some of our more elite schools have managed to give kids a somewhat uninterrupted learning experience, in some ways, but for our more vulnerable children, what do you think the impact has been, the long-term impact? And can you share a little bit about your research on this impact?
Thank you so much, Maya. Thank you for the invitation. Before I address your question, let me just say to those I'm getting to meet, how pleased I am to be here for two reasons. Number one, because there is no greater pleasure to someone who goes into teaching than to watch our former students go on and do good things in the world. So I'm very proud of Maya. I'm very glad to see what she is doing with this organization. And the second thing I want to comment is on the metaphor that is implied in the name tree. One of the things Maya did not say is that one of my hobbies is to write children's books. And I am writing a children's book on trees. And so in that context, I'm reading a lot on the actual science of trees. And this is a book I recommend. One of the things I have learned about the emerging study of trees is that trees can only be understood in the context. You have to look below the surface to understand trees, because below the surface, trees are interconnected and they communicate with one another, not only across the same species, but across different species. So there is this researcher in British Columbia, Canada, for example, that has found that if one tree doesn't have any leaves and cannot get oxygen, they may stay alive for a long time because the trees around them, through the roots, share the nutrients that they need to stay alive. So I'm hoping that this community called tree is going to be what is below the surface that gives each of you the opportunity to be your best self and to make a difference. And I think that in the context of the pandemic, it's very important to do that, because this is a situation that we're living in for which nobody had a script. This is a once in a lifetime occasion. We're all trying to learn as we go, but we are going to learn faster and we're going to manage faster if we do this in good company. And so the fact that you have this community to help you make sense of the moment and to help you bring your best selves to this moment is very important. Now, on to your question. I have spent, let me bring you back to February of 2020. In February of 2020, I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine, a professor in the School of Public Health, and I was excited because I had a new book that had just been published, and I was going to spend our spring break launching that book in Mexico. And I tell him, no, I'll be in Mexico in spring break. And he said, this is like mid-February. He said, I don't think you're going to be in Mexico. In fact, you should be canceling all your travel for the next 18 to 24 months. And I said, why? He said, because this thing that just started in Wuhan that you've been reading about, this is going to become a pandemic. And airports and airplanes are very bad places to be during the pandemic. And immediately I didn't believe him. But then I went home and I began to read some information and I realized, oh my God, Rifat is right. This is going to be terrible. And then the next question that occurred to me was, well, how am I going to do my work? How am I going to teach? How am I going to do my research? And then from there, I thought, well, how is everyone in this business going to do it? And my inclination is to try not to dwell on problems for too long, but try to figure out what can I do about problems. So I reached out to colleagues in a number of international development organizations, and UNESCO, the World Bank, things like that. And the head of education of the OECD responded within 20 minutes. I said, Andreas, I am concerned. I have just learned that this is likely to become a pandemic, and I think this is going to cause tremendous harm to education systems around the world. We should try to do something to be helpful. So he says, let's get on the phone. So within an hour, I was on the phone with Andreas and he said, what do you think we should do? I said, I have no idea. Why don't we just send a survey out and ask education authorities, administrators around the world, what are the challenges that they foresee? What plans do they have in place? What do they need? And so we designed a survey when on March 11, the World Health Organization declared this a pandemic. That very week, we launched our survey, and within a week, we had produced a report. And we began to discuss the report in meetings like these, virtual meetings, that were attended by many people. I think for the very same reason that you're coming together, because people were looking for a community to make sense of the moment. And the experience began to concern me greatly, because the main finding of that survey was that no one had any plans. No one had any confidence that they were going to be able to manage that. Everybody anticipated this is going to be terrible for poor kids because we know they don't have connectivity. We know their teachers don't know how to teach them, and we don't know what to do. And we thought, oh, this is terrible. So the more we talked about it. So then I changed the framing a little bit. And I said, well, if we keep having these conversations on the looming disaster in education, we're just going to accelerate. We're going to cause people to want to crawl under the bed, under the table, hoping for this to go away. And remember, this was in April of last year. In April, we didn't have a vaccine. We didn't know when we were going to have a vaccine. And so I said to Andreas, we need to begin to balance this conversation about the real risks with a sense of possibility. And one of the things that I have learned in my own work is that you can always, it's always easier to move a system towards productive action if you show people, if you inspire people with the good things that are happening, than if you bang them over their head with all the problems of the world, where the sky is falling. So we said, let's begin to write some case studies about efforts around the world that are trying to educate kids in this difficult context. And I reached out to my former students like Maya, and I said, listen, why don't we begin to identify some good things that are happening and write them? And within a few months, we had 100 of those. So now we began to balance this research on the risks, the dangers, the problems, with research on, but there is always a way, and what is being done, and how can we learn together faster so that we can help each other figure out what to do. So then let me go back to your question. And since then, I've been doing a ton of research. I mean, all I've been doing, other than teaching my own students for the last 20 months, is research on COVID and the impact of COVID on education, and trying to generate knowledge that is useful to figure out how to make the best of this moment. And the booklet that I have just shared with you, I've placed two links on the chat box. One is a link to that booklet that Maya mentioned, which is a synthesis of this research conducted over 20 months. And the other one is the booklet that I was going to launch in Mexico when I thought I was going to go there during our spring break last year. And the story is the following. Obviously, this pandemic has been an education calamity. There is no other way to put it. Why has it been a calamity? It has been a calamity for education and for non-education reasons. Let me begin with the non-education reasons. A lot of people have died. A lot of people have gotten sick. So they and their families and their dependent have been affected. No question about that. I mean, imagine if you lose your father, your mother to this pandemic. Your life will forever be changed, right? In addition to that, people have lived with the stress, with the fear of knowing that they could be the next one. And to live in fear for 20 months is a lot to ask of most people. So obviously, this has affected all of us, how we think about ourselves, our sense of purpose, how we bring ourselves to the work, to what we do. It is no wonder that some people feel a little despair. In addition to that, the pandemic has taken a lot of resources on the part of governments to deal with the health crisis, production of vaccines, distribution of vaccines, helping people. And that has reduced the amount of money that governments have for other things like education. So there is an undeniable new austerity in education. In addition to that, families, their incomes have diminished. Why? Because economic activity has diminished. In much of the world, there has been an economic recession. Why? Because you close down businesses, people don't have money, they don't buy things, and all of a sudden, people begin to lose jobs, or they have the same jobs, but they earn less money. Now, these are all effects outside of education. And in addition, I think this pandemic has complicated other challenges that existed before. So one of the terrible challenges around the world is that I think the way in which some of these new technologies are being used is dividing people into echo chambers, right? We have a new intolerance. You know these very well in India. It's a sad story. There's always been some intolerance at the root of your society, sadly, among Muslims and Hindus. But there is a new intolerance in that politicians have decided they're going to make their careers blaming the other for the problems of the country. All of a sudden, this context has made it easier for people to do that. You know, people are looking for a scapegoat. They're looking for someone to blame. So if you're a bad leader, like Donald Trump, who decided, for example, to scapegoat immigrants in this country, people who are brown, people who didn't look like him. In this context, you begin to tell people who are feeling scared, who don't have jobs, well, and your situation is made worse because we have all these immigrants coming over the border, because we have all these people, because he began to call this the Chinese virus. And all of a sudden in this country, we began to have attacks to people who had Asian features, people of Asian descent. Terrible. I mean, old ladies waiting on bus stops were being bitten by people because all of a sudden there was a segment of the population who was activated around hate. So these are all the effects outside education. Onto the education effects, and you know it well. Many countries shut down schools. And when you shut down the schools, you have to scramble, trying to figure out, well, how are you going to teach? So what most governments did is they said, well, let's use internet, let's use television, let's use radio. But of course, we hadn't been practicing. It's not that people cannot learn with those things. We hadn't been practicing the skills of teaching well in those ways. So many kids have been left behind. Many kids have not engaged. They haven't learned. They know less than they did before the pandemic. Sao Paulo in Brazil did a study recently of fifth graders in mathematics and language. And the math skills of those children are below the math skills of second graders 3 years ago. So it's not that they didn't learn this year, it's that they forgot what they knew, and a little bit less for the language skills. So this is what the learning loss that people talk about, and that's a reality that we have to cope with. We also, I think, have to look beyond the learning loss in academic subjects, because I think this pandemic has affected the sense of well-being of people, their sense of connection, their sense of purpose. And I think we need to learn more about that. We need to learn, how are the children? How are they making sense of the moment? So that's the calamity aspect of it. Obviously, teachers have been affected. Many teachers have children. All of a sudden, they have to mind their own children at home while they have to educate their own children remotely. They have to do things they had never done with very little support in very little time. So this is frustrating. This is frustrating. This causes stress, and for some people, burnout. Some people are saying, you know what? I don't think I want to keep doing this. But I also think it's important to keep open our minds to a sense of possibility and to ask the question not only of what wasn't learned, what are the gaps that have increased, what are the challenges we need to solve, but we also need to ask, but what was learned? What was good that happened in this crisis? Let's try to understand that. Let's try to see what innovations were created so that maybe we can use some of that knowledge to help us build an education system. When I talk to governments and to researchers and to educators around the world about the impact of the pandemic, the first idea that comes to most of them is learning loss. But we forget that learning loss assumes that the system we had before the pandemic was fine. And I don't think it was fine for many kids. I don't think it was helping many children develop a sense of well-being, a sense of purpose, autonomy, the capacity to work with others, the capacity to set goals for themselves, the capacity to learn independently. I don't think it was doing that at all. For many children, it was a very debilitating system. It made them live in fear of going to school. It made them forget the natural curiosity that children have when they go to school. It made some of the kids hate learning. And so this is a time when we should ask, have we learned something good about how to do things better? Because by necessity, teachers have had to give their students more unstructured time. They have had to depend more on the initiative and the responsibility of their students. They have had to let the students figure it out on their own. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe we should be doing more of those things. I'm not saying we should let kids to their own resources, but I am saying that the idea that schools are about cramming content into the minds of kids is a terrible idea. Schools should be about helping people develop a sense of who they are, a purpose for their lives, and the skills to become their best selves and to be able to work with others in making their communities better. And I don't think many schools were doing that very well. So maybe this pandemic is a moment for all of us to ask deep questions about our own purpose, about why are we in this profession? What are we trying to do when we teach? How can we do better going forward? If we survive, of course, if we survive, I'm keenly aware that this is not over. And I also think it's not going to be over soon. I think that we're going to live in pandemic mode for some time because this pandemic is going to keep mutating and because our ability to effectively deliver vaccines and to get people to be vaccinated is proven to be rather limited. So at best, the best predictions is it'll be the end of time for new strands of the virus to develop. And so that's why in this guide, which I have shared with you, I say this is a moment. Imagine an education system that is blended from the beginning, that begins with I don't know what happened. I think I got disconnected briefly, but I'm glad to be back. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear
I
you
don't
now.
know what happened.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no
So
worries.
I think this is a moment to think anew, to bring a sense of possibility, to bring our best selves to the
Fernando, I think you are disconnected again here.
You don't hear me now?
Now I can hear you. I can hear you again.
All
Yes.
right, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what's going on.
No, no
It
worries.
says that my internet connection is unstable. I don't know what's going on and that my network bandwidth is low. Let me go back to the network. Just give me a moment. I'm going to change my room.
Okay. While Fernando changes his room, I would love to ask all of the educators here with us today to share in the chat box some of the questions you're asking yourself as an educator. You know, Fernando said this is perhaps a time when, as educators, we need to ask ourselves questions, and maybe we can.
Flaca, ¿estás usando el internet? I
Uh,
don't know what's going on.
Fernando, hi, I can hear you now.
Oh,
But
I apologize. Okay, so I have changed rooms. Let's see how this works.
so I was
Can you hear
asking.
me better now?
Yeah, I can. I was just asking educators in our call, Fernando, to share their questions. I love the fact that you said this is a time for us to ask questions of ourselves. And maybe one of the things coming out of this pandemic is for us to stop, pause, use it as a time to reflect and say, well, what can we actually do better? How can we reimagine things better when we reopen schools, when we restart, instead of going back to business as usual, which was not that great to begin with, perhaps, which had its flaws. So I'd love to have everybody just share very quickly questions that you're asking yourself as an educator at this point in time about education, about your role and purpose, and also about going back to school, because I know schools are talking about reopening. So if you want to share in the chat box, I would love to hear some of those questions that you may be thinking about as educators. I'm giving everybody just a minute or two because I know coming up with questions may, you need to think about that as well. And in the meantime, Fernando, what are you've shared some of the big questions that you've asked. How do we make things better? Because it wasn't necessarily, uh, we didn't necessarily have great systems to begin with. And on that note, I wanted to kind of ask a follow-up question about reopening schools. If you look at the data in Indian schools, and I'm talking not about our more affluent schools, but about our government schools, low-income schools, schools that educate the vast majority of children. Actually, the data shows that there isn't that much learning from year to year. That the teachers are covering curriculum, but children seem to be very behind. And all of the ASER surveys, for example, even the PISA tests that were taken by kids some years ago, they show that kids are very behind where they should. This was pre-COVID, that they were behind where they should be. So you're right, the system was not working perfectly before the pandemic at all. So this is a time for us to perhaps reimagine, reinvent. Um, as educators start thinking about going back to school, what would you recommend? What are the big things that you would kind of want to share with them as they're starting over? Because we are in
Yeah,
India starting to think about reopening.
I will refer to the guide which I have shared with you. I think that there are three things that we should have as goals. Number one, of course, we have to worry about what the children did not learn. But in thinking about that question, I believe our focus should be less on what content didn't we deliver and should be more on what competencies did students not develop. And those are two separate things. The content is a means to develop competencies. It's not the competency in itself. But if you think about a traditional curriculum, there is often a lot of repetition. It often moves unnecessarily slowly. And so one of the ideas, which I'm going to come back to, that I think we ought to learn more about, is the idea of accelerated learning. Focus on the competencies and figure out different pathways to help students achieve the competencies. So that's goal number one. What competencies do we need to make sure that students develop? The second thing we need to do at the same time is building a blended system. Everybody should be trying to build a system that has a face-to-face component and an online component, and that helps us transition back and forth as the public health situation requires that. Why? Number one, because in the 21st century, it's very important for people to learn to teach online because lifelong learning is going to be essential. And the way in which most of us are going to learn as adults is online. It's the way most of you have been learning. It's the way in which we're communicating right now. So we should be giving students a practice on how to learn online. And as teachers, that means we have to develop our capacities to do that well, which is not really the way in which we have done. Most of us have done online learning during the pandemic. And the third goal is this is the time to be reimagining an education system so that we develop competencies we're not developing before. This is a time for us to ask ourselves, if the goal of education is to develop whole human beings, people that have cognitive skills, but that also have social skills, that also have self-knowledge, and if we know we were not doing a great job at providing that balanced education, what do we need to do differently? So those three goals: recover competencies, build a blended system, broaden the goals. To do that, we have to do three things. Number one, we have to see where students are. We have to see where we are. We have to see where communities are. And in the guide I have shared with you, I offer 5 areas of assessment. The term is assessment. One of the first things we need to do is to check with our students, how are you doing? Not what did you not learn? How are you doing? How is your motivation? How's your life? What are you thinking? How are you making, how are you coming to the school? But we also need to ask our colleagues the same question and ourselves the same question. Because I think one of the tasks we're going to need to do is to help people re-engage with learning and see a sense of purpose in this work. And we know that learning is always best when it is authentic and relevant. What does relevant mean? That it connects to things that we value. And one of the things that happens in a context when people are dying is that many of us are asking, what's the point of doing this? Why do I have to learn fractions when I could be losing my life or my family could be losing their lives? And relevant and authentic means we have to understand the connection of what we learn to the world in which we live. So obviously, to not talk about the pandemic to our students, to not use as a teachable moment, is just very poor teaching. And most students are going to see the hypocrisy in it. They're going to say, look, here we are in a major tragedy, and my teacher is going on nonchalantly as if we were living in La La Land. They're going to think we're disconnected from the world if we do that. And so task number one, assess. Task number two is develop a strategy. Every school needs to have a strategy. I don't mean teachers as individuals. I mean teachers as collectives in a school. And in the guide, I offer 7 specific ideas about what needs to be in that strategy. Top among them is identify the children who have suffered the most. Make sure you engage them. Who do I have in mind? A child who lost their mother or their father to COVID or their grandparent and who has been obviously traumatized by this pandemic. They have to be top of mind for us. We have to figure out how do we support that child because they have suffered more than others and they need us more than others. But also the children who are economically vulnerable, the children whose families were thrown into conditions where now they're hungry and they were not hungry before and they're skipping meals. They need to be top of mind. We need to figure out how do we extend solidarity because perhaps this is the biggest lesson that we could be teaching our students in this moment. What is the meaning of being a member of a community? What does solidarity mean? I realize that most of you are working in public schools, and it's possible that you don't have many students who are hungry. Although I think we should still ask the question, we should still see, we shouldn't assume that. But if your students see you act in a way that is indifferent to the pain and the suffering that is going all around you, this is what they will remember. This is what you will have taught them, whether you want it or not. And so that's the top priority of a strategy, but there are other components in that strategy. The idea of accelerated learning. There is a lot of good research on remedial education. Remedial education is what we try to do when we think our students couldn't learn some content and we try to teach it again. And most of the research on remedial education is that for the most part, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Once you begin to try to remediate, the kids keep falling further and further behind. But there is an approach that is the exact opposite of remedial education. It's called accelerated learning. And accelerated learning is about assuming that kids are smart and assuming that there are different ways, more efficient, to get them to the same endpoint in terms of competence, not in terms of content. Get them to the same point, just differently. So educate yourselves. Maybe one of the meetings of one of the topics for your convenings, Maya, should be on accelerated learning. What does that look like? How do you do accelerated learning? The other thing that is very important in that strategy is take the time to learn. What did you learn as teachers? What did you learn that was good and that should continue? One of the things I have found is that in many countries, teachers collaborated a whole lot more than they do normally. And that the way in which they collaborated was much more democratic than it normally is in schools. That schools sometimes are governed as these little bureaucracies, like the Indian bureaucracy, right? It's top down. The people in the top always think they have the answers, even if they don't know what the right questions to ask are. And what they do is they stifle the creativity, the professionalism, the goodness of the people below them. They engage them in a yes, sir mentality. This is the only thing that is accepted. Of course, terrible. I mean, this was good to rule an empire, and it may be good to run a society run by servants, but it's not good to build learning organizations. And it's not good to prepare people to live in a democracy or to add value based on knowledge. And obviously, one of the things we all should be doing is asking, how do we build schools that are true learning organizations, that are true democratic communities, where everybody brings their selves, where we begin with the assumption that everyone has something to offer. And I think the pandemic, for many people, created a context that actually made it possible for them to experience for the first time what true collaborative professionalism looked like. So take the time to assess, did that happen in your school? And if so, what made it possible? And how do you keep it? How do you make sure that when you go back, you don't kill that? I have a hypothesis. I haven't tested these yet. My hypothesis is that some of these top-down, heavy-handed administrative approach to running schools was upended during the pandemic because it was impossible. And that these administrators are very, very nervous, very wary of the freedom that the pandemic unleashed on their teachers and their students. And that they're going to double down and going to try to bring us back to normal and put the screws on people and remind us that we're not really professionals. We're not truly capable of governing ourselves, that we need them. But this is more about the insecurities of those people over their role than about whether that approach contributes anything to education. So I think we should resist it as professionals. I see that happening in my university. I see that happening in many universities. At the moment, universities in America are all pushing people to come back face to face and not do anything online, even though we have discovered that some online learning is good, and they want to kill it. And they want to kill it, I think, number one, because this kind of top-down vigilante governance administration is very difficult to do in an online environment, right? When I decide to meet with my colleagues, my principal doesn't even need to know that I'm having these meetings. And that makes some principals very nervous that all of a sudden their teachers have been empowered in that way. So I'm inviting you to be subversive of the existing education order, because I think the existing education order was very misguided in many ways in preparing people who can become autonomous agents capable of governing themselves and of participating in governance of their communities with other people. So that's the second step of things. And the third set of things, of course, is build capacity. Building capacity is going to be essential. So I invite you all to read that guide. I can only right now give you broad strokes of what's in that guide, but that's my invitation for the current moment. I'm sorry that I keep moving my computer. One of the things that this pandemic has done for all of us is taught us to be flexible and to be humble and to have a sense of humor, because things aren't always going to function the way we thought. And I think that's not all that bad. I've done that with my students in teaching online, and they kind of like it. It makes us all more human. Roshni, thank you. Go ahead, Maya.
So I think what has come to me just listening to you, Fernando. One is this idea of asking questions. I feel that's really powerful for teachers to start broadening the kinds of questions we ask, because so far most of the questions have been around learning loss and logistics and fear-based questions. But I think if we can shift to this idea of questions with a sense of possibility and say, okay, how do we use this to reimagine what we can do, what is possible, what our purpose is. I find that very powerful and inspiring. So I hope as a community of educators here, we're all listening to that idea. And also that,
Here's an invitation to all of you. You could do that together. Why
yes,
don't you each commit to taking 1 hour this weekend to ask yourself, what was one good thing that you saw, that you learned during this pandemic? What was one good thing that you did or that others did that you say, wow, I wouldn't have done this but for the pandemic? And then write it down in a page or two,
mm,
share it with each other. Maya can put that together as a little book. And let's call that Letters on Possibility, and publish that book for one another and for others. It's such a simple thing, but it goes back to the idea of the trees and the forest. I think that if you each contribute one essay, maybe 1 hour of your time to think about that and a couple of hours to write it down, and you put that together, it'll be like this work that happens under the earth, under the ground, when trees communicate with each other and give each other nutrients and see, wow, it wasn't all that bad. Look at what we can do. And then if you make that knowledge visible, there is such a powerful lesson in that. The lesson that teaching is the kind of profession that should be shaped by teachers themselves, that you are capable of producing knowledge, that you are not cogs and wheels in a machinery, but true professionals who are capable of reflecting on your experience and on turning what you learn into knowledge that is useful not just for you, but for the profession of which you're members. And that in making that knowledge visible and that approach visible, you can inspire others. Who knows? You could begin a movement in India. So this is my challenge to you today. Do something.
yeah.
Stop contemplating the problem. Stop feeling sorry for yourself and be grateful that you're alive and that you have each other. And ask yourself the hard question: am I really doing everything in my power to lead? This is a moment when my students and others need me to lead. Am I measuring up?
I think that's a powerful question. And I think even just the idea of compassion at this time, right? That perhaps we're so worried about content, coverage. Those are things that seem to rule Indian schools. In fact, one of the terms I hate is cover. We need to cover the curriculum, cover, cover, cover. But I think if we can use the pandemic to shift to talking about learning, talking about growth, talking about possibility, talking about compassion, community, coming together, then it could actually be a very powerful learning experience for everybody. So I love those ideas. So on that note, Fernando, I mean, you've given us lots of advice in terms of the things we need to assess when kids come back, the idea of focusing on competencies instead of content, and on accelerating learning instead of just worrying about remediation. Um, do you have, in terms of, as a community of educators, do we have any kind of collective responsibility, even if many of us work in schools where our students have actually been fairly privileged in terms of having access to devices, access to online teaching? One of the things that one of the questions I've been asking myself, I think, as an educator and as part of TREE, is what is our collective responsibility to our society as educators? Like, what do you have any advice for us here? I mean, how do we?
I don't have advice. It would be pretentious of me to give you advice because I don't know most of you. I know Maya. I certainly think Maya has a responsibility because I know her and she's my student, but I don't know about the rest of you. Uh, I'll tell you what I have done. I certainly think I have a lot of responsibility. Um, and so I'll take myself as an example in hopes that we're no different and that maybe you can apply to yourself the questions that I applied to myself. When I reached out to my colleague back in February, Andrea Schleicher, and I said, what can we do? I did it because I actually think that the world in which we live is one in which we are interdependent with one another. We are like the trees that are connected to other trees, even trees that are very far away. And that idea is not my idea. Other people thought about it before. And I think the people who thought about that idea with greatest clarity were a group of people after World War II who looked at the devastation, the death, the violence of that war, and asked themselves, what could we have done differently to prevent that? And how do we make sure this never happens again? And as a result of that reflection, they came up with an amazing creation, a little document, 2 pages, with 30 short ideas. The document said, every person has a dignity just because they are a human being. A human being is not a means to an end. A human being is an end in itself. And we all have the same dignity. And let's be clear on what are the rights that that dignity gives you. And let's build a world in which those rights are the reality. So they wrote 30 ideas in a document which they labeled the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that act of imagination, I mean, it was totally bold and revolutionary in 1945 to say a human is not a means to an end, is an end in itself. And every human, whether it's a girl, it's a boy, black, white, Indian, Brazilian, French, um, low caste, high caste, poor, rich, Muslim, Hindu, Christian, have the same rights. And we have a shared responsibility to make those rights a reality. Now, let me give you an example of what an act of imagination like that can do. In 1948, when the Declaration was adopted, there were 2.8 million people in the 2.8 billion people in the world, of which only 45% had set foot in a school. So fast forward to 2021, almost 80 years later, there are 8 billion people in the world. Tremendous increase from 2.5 billion to 8 billion. More than 90% of them have spent a number of years in schools. This is just remarkable. This is just remarkable. It is, to my mind, one of the greatest revolutions in the history of humanity. And it began because a small group of people actually had the audacity to think that everyone had the right to be educated, because the right to education is one of those 30 rights. And then as a result of that radical act of imagination, there were people who chose to live their lives to make that a reality. And they understood that we're bound to one another, that we can never achieve our rights if we don't engage in helping others achieve their rights. So the answer to your question, Maya, is I cannot be at peace with myself when I know that with the rise of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan, the right to education and most human rights of those girls and women are at risk. This is my business. This is not somebody else's business. I cannot be at peace when I know that in Boston, 20% of the children have learned very little. I cannot be at peace when I know that in Brazil, the government has been missing in action in terms of trying to support the public schools. I think this is my business. What we each need to figure out is how do we go from that broad sense of shared responsibility with the other members of our species in trying to advance a sense of education with the possibilities that are in front of us, which are sometimes greater than we imagine, but which are not unlimited, right? The day has so many hours, there are so many things we must do, and we must make choices. So I guess the way I answer for myself your question, not going to answer the question for each of you because that would be pretentious because I don't know you. But I think that if you ask Fernando, do you have any responsibility to people other than your own students at Harvard? The answer is yes. And if the question is, how do you act on that responsibility? The answer is, I do everything in my power to try to be helpful in this moment. Because the way I think about this moment is as a moment of great risk, as the Titanic sinking. And I don't mean just the education systems, I mean a great risk for society. And I think in a context like that, What we all need to do is to reach out and to say, how can I help? How can I help from my own sphere of influence? If you were to ask me, Maya, this would be a little bit pretentious, but less so. Do I think Maya has a responsibility to people other than this community? My answer would be yes. I think Maya should be using her privilege and her education and her experience and her resources to try to be helpful to people other than those who lead private schools. As for the rest of you, you need to answer the question for yourselves.
And I think that's, it's an important question perhaps at this time, in this kind of situation, at this moment in time, for all of us to ask ourselves, right? What is our collective responsibility? To, of course, first and foremost, to your students who you're going to be interacting with as teachers, that itself is huge, right? Every child who comes into your class, and especially children who, I mean, for all children, I think it's been really hard in some way or another. And for some kids, very, very difficult. So, how for each of those children, how can we, first of all, model compassion, model humanity, be a person they can connect with, um, and be the best teacher for them, help them with their learning, not worry so much about content and coverage, but learning. But then, even beyond that, how can we be helpful within our schools, within our local communities, within the larger community? And what is our responsibility, right? I think each of us does have a responsibility. And I mean, it's a question, certainly, Fernando, I've been asking myself a lot. What is our collective responsibility and what is my personal responsibility in this kind of
And remember, Maya, that
mm,
your personal responsibility is not disconnected from your teaching responsibility to your students for two reasons. Number one, because our students learn, all of you who are teachers or who are parents know that our students and our children learn a whole more from the way in which we live our lives than from anything that we try to teach them. They're not stupid. And so they're watching. And I think that how we behave is probably the most important ethical lesson that we could be teaching our students at this moment. The second thing is there may be a way in which you bring your students to exercise that responsibility that will be good for them. So let me give you an example of how I have done that. Now, I'm very lucky because I teach in an institution where I get to teach students like Maya many years ago when she was my student. So what I did last year with the students that are 15 years younger than Maya is today is I told them in a class in education policy that I teach, I said, it would be ridiculous to talk about education policy at a moment when every government in the world needs all the help they can get in figuring out what the right policy is. So we're going to be helpful. You're each going to find a government that needs a little help. And you're going to tell them, I'm taking this class on policy, and I would like to spend my semester helping you understand how is the pandemic impacting the children in your jurisdiction? What are you doing about it? And how can you do better? So I put together teams of students. They work with governments in Bangladesh, in Mexico, in Costa Rica, in Texas, in different places. And basically, the entire semester, they were advisors to the governments. And you might say, what difference can it make? A whole difference. Governments are so stretched out in their capacity. They're so hungry for help that to get the talent of 4 graduate students who are spending a lot of hours thinking about them was very valuable to all of them. And then not only did they help them, I mean, the final product for this course were the recommendations they had made to those governments about what to do. That I said, we need to share this with others. And so we published that as a book. And we published that book. The course ended in January of this year. And in March of that year, we had published that book. And the director of UNESCO said, Fernando, this is incredibly valuable because not only are there good recommendations about what to do, you're modeling what universities could be doing at this moment. There are 28,000 universities in the world. If in each one of them, only one professor engage 10 team of students in doing that, do you realize the power, the collective power that we could bring to help this crisis? So she wrote the introduction to that book, and she said, I want to present this book to a global conference of ministers of education to encourage them to promote similar things. So we did. Now imagine the benefit to my students of having being part of a solution in having learned that as many of them, these are young professionals, as they're beginning their career, imagine what they learn from being helpful to a government, from knowing that at this difficult time for humanity, they tried to be part of the solution. Imagine the learnings for them to have seen their work shared at a global convening of ministers of education. So I think this is an opportunity, certainly for universities, to connect three missions which are part of the university: teaching, advancing knowledge, and being of service to society. And very often these missions are very disconnected. The pandemic gave me an opportunity to connect them better for the benefit of my students. So not only were my students of service to the world, being of service to the world was valuable to their education. I think helped them develop skills that are incredibly important for the future, for their own future. And I suspect that even if you don't teach graduate students, there are ways in which your service to the world could engage your students in a way that would be beneficial to your students.
I was just thinking, actually, getting our students, maybe one of the things coming out of the pandemic would be, how do we get our students to engage with their communities more? And how do we, how do we bring service into schools in a much more deep and real, authentic way? Because our students, I mean, they may not be advising governments, but certainly they can help in their communities in different ways. They can identify problems, be part of solutions, and we
I mean,
can.
maybe one thing that any student can do
Mhm.
is they can help another student
Yeah,
learn some things they didn't learn.
yes,
Imagine older students tutoring younger students in your school or in other school.
yeah.
Imagine students learning to take care of one another, to check in their well-being. Imagine, um, I know a wonderful school in South Africa that works in very, very poor slums and that teaches math and science and that has an incredible record of success in preparing students who come from very disadvantaged backgrounds to enter universities that are very difficult to access in South Africa. And one of the things that teachers in that school have done for years is not about the pandemic, is something very simple. They begin every class with the teacher sitting their students in circle and checking in. Every student talks for a minute or two. The simple question from the teacher is, how are you doing? And they attribute a lot of their success to the emotional climate that that simple act creates, because they say these students know that their teachers care about them as people, not as empty vessels that they have to fill with content, but as whole human beings. Now, we could all build in our institutions a culture of care, a culture of looking out for one another. I mean, I hope this doesn't happen in your schools, that in so many schools there are these horrible things like bullying, where children learn to mistreat one another, where they mistreat one another and they know that the teachers turn a blind eye to the violence they're perpetrating. This is one of the things that I know goes on around the world. And that was not great that it was going on, right? That's why I don't really have an idealized vision of education before the pandemic. So maybe it's time to change that. Maybe it's time to say, you know what? We should be looking out for one another. We should be creating a culture in our schools where we actually care about the people who are members of our community. Let's not only model for our students what that looks like, but let's build norms, let's build routines, let's make this part of the everyday life of a school.
And I think on that note, I'm just looking at the time. I would love to have questions, thoughts from the audience, just about anything that any question that you have for Fernando, or any thoughts you have based on the talk as you're thinking about using this time, this whole period of disruption, as a way to ask reflective questions of yourself as a teacher. What is my purpose? Why am I doing this? How can I do it better? The system we had before was not a perfect system in so many ways. So how do we use this time to reimagine things, do things better, instead of going back to business as usual? Because I think one of the biggest tragedies would be if we do reopen schools, we go back and everything is exactly as it was pre-pandemic, or everybody's trying to just normalize things to what it was, instead of saying, hey, what have we learned? How can we do things better? How can we be more human? How can we take advantage of technology differently? How can we actually use the learnings and the community um, to be better this time? So I would love to invite you all in the last 5, 6 minutes to just share any questions, thoughts. I can already see in the chat box, Janani just talked about how she's been asking children about what happens in the world around them, talking about what's going on, and that has really helped students. Um, she said she recently used the Afghanistan situation in high school. And I think definitely talking about what's happening, the pandemic, the reopening of schools, Afghanistan, whatever you want to, but engaging students in the world around. I'm just looking at the chat box here. Um, Lots of questions about going back to school, blended learning. How are we going to structure blended practices without overloading learners? Um, if we're talking about building skills and competencies such as critical thinking and research, should we not change the way we test students, which are currently more content focused? And I think that's a really interesting question, Sindhu, because one of the things this pandemic has done is raise questions about testing too, because we've had 2 years with no board exams, right? And a very different way of thinking about testing and how necessary is it? What kind of testing do we need? So maybe using this time to really think through all of these different things. But yeah, so if anybody wants to share questions, thoughts in the chat box, that would be great. And I think more than anything, what I've gotten, Fernando, as I've been listening to you, is really moving my thinking from learning loss and logistics to starting to think much more big picture about possibilities and purpose. And I feel like if teachers can make that shift, it's something I've been thinking about just listening to you. I feel like that's quite powerful because it changes things a lot.
And remember, Maya, hope and possibility is not written in the stars. It's not something that someone external to ourselves is going to hand down to us. Hope and possibility is up to us. Is a result of we really have a choice. We really have a choice. It is not predetermined that this is the end of education or the worst thing that could happen to humanity. Depends on how we choose to act, how each and every one of us chooses to act. I could choose to say, this is a terrible moment and bring my worst self to my students. And what do you think that would do to the 100 people that I will be impacting this year? If I decided I'm just going to talk about all the loss, I'll produce a generation of people who see the world that way. Or I could instead, I'm not suggesting that we should lie or deceive people or deny objective truth, but I do think we have an obligation to demonstrate, to model what complex thinking looks like. And a situation like this requires complex thinking. The situation is neither black nor white. It's both black and white. And we need to think about systems. We need to understand the kinds of how schools function as systems, how schools connected with one another are systems, and how schools are systemically connected to other institutions in society. And it is in the nature of systems of complex systems, that small actions can have very big effects. The butterfly effect, that a butterfly flapping her wings in the river in an Amazon can produce a hurricane in Texas. And I think that is the mindset that I choose to bring to my work. I see myself as a butterfly. I can only flap my wings, but I believe that I have the power to inspire my students, my former students, the people that I collaborate with, hopefully people like you, not just with my words, but with my examples. It's very easy. If you Google my name, you'll realize this guy wasn't just talking. He was actually doing a lot of work during this pandemic. And I recognize that each of you has the same power that I have to do a lot. I mean, a human life is precious. The possibility, the power that we have if we choose to take ourselves seriously. I think it was Luther King that said, fear nothing but your own fear. Fear nothing but your own fear to make a difference, right? I think if we choose to take ourselves seriously at this historical moment, we can make this a wonderful opportunity for a renaissance, truly for a renaissance. And so, but I think the way to do that is to liberate ourselves from the fear that says, the Taliban is coming. Yes, the Taliban could be coming in every society, including in America. But I think it depends on whether people of goodwill decide to do what people in Afghanistan did, which was to quit and let them take over, or whether they do something else. I still cannot make sense of that situation. That's probably a conversation for another time. But in all this conversation on the Taliban, to me, the big conversation we should be having is, what did the army do? What did the people who had been governing, what did the president do? They quit. They basically gave them their weapons. They sold their weapons to the Taliban. So that doesn't mean I don't have responsibility. We don't have responsibility, but we should be asking the question, right? What did people do in the face of that risk?
So I think, yeah, I mean, I think the big learning is for all of us as educators that we need to be asking questions, right? And the better our questions, the deeper, the more reflective, more profound, the more transformation we will and more impact we will be able to
I would
have.
add only one thing. I agree. Very important to be asking questions and to be trying to see the big picture. But we should also be asking ourselves every day, and what am I doing other than asking questions?
Right.
What am I doing with my
Translate
waking
that into
hours? So
action.
I think that when we face complex problems, we shouldn't rush to action, but we shouldn't avoid action.
Right.
Because the way to tackle a complex problem is to start actually doing something.
Mm,
And even if you don't fully understand the complexity, and even if you don't have a complete plan, as you act, it's like a journey. As you take the first step, what you learn from that step makes you better understand the situation, makes it clear what the next step is. So if there is something I would hope to convey today, is not only the great power that you have in each other in the community, but the great power that comes in your ability to do.
mm.
Perhaps what you're doing, but maybe even more than what you're doing.
And I think that's a wonderful note for us to wrap up on, Fernando. It's inspiring. I hope all our educators here today have taken something away and leave inspired and excited instead of afraid, leaving inspired and excited about the possibilities that lie ahead as we do reopen schools, as we do re-engage with kids in all kinds of different ways. How do we learn from this? How do we move forward better? How do we create something even better than what we had pre-COVID? Through this moment. Thank you so
Thank
much
you,
for
Maya, for having
very,
created
very much.
this community, which you have labeled tree, and which I certainly know that you cannot understand the tree if you do not see the forest. And I think that what you're really creating is a forest. It's not a tree, but it's a tree in communication with one another. And what is most important about this community is not the individual trees that you see above the surface, but is what happens below the surface as each of you learns from each other, supports each other, inspires each other. Thank you
Yeah,
so very much. To one comment that I saw in the chat, I will reiterate to the students the importance of being part of the solution. Yes. And remember that the way you will actually teach them that is not by reiterating it, but by teaching by example.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Fernando. Thank you so much to all of our educators here together today. And we hope you will stay in touch with Tree and we will keep engaging you in different ways. And
I look
thanks
forward
so
to
much.
reading the book you're going to write on stories of hope and possibility.
Yes.
That ball is in your court, Maya. Bye, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Fernando. Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.